Literature webinar series. And today we have the great pleasure of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. Now, I am delighted to have three distinguished scholars speaking on Huckleberry Finn. Some of their books are going to appear in the chat button, I believe, on down there for you can go and purchase their books on Amazon, but in alphabetical order. Dr. Carolyn Breashears is professor of English at St. Lawrence University. If I mispronounced your last name, please forgive me. Recent publications include 18th Century Women's Writing and the Scandalous Memoir, plus articles in Afraben Online and the International Journal of Pluralistic and Economics Education. Dr. Alan Gribben has taught English at Auburn University for several decades and is the current and served as the Nance alumni professor for the final 13 years of his tenure. Currently Professor Emeritus, co-founded the Mark Twain Circle of America, editor of the Mark Twain Journal, an extraordinary number of other Mark Twain in particular related credits in his biography. And then Dr. Robert Lamb is professor of English in the College of Liberal Arts at Purdue University, author of, among other things, James G. Birney and the Road to Abolitionism, Art Matters, Hemingway, Craft, and the Creation of the Modern Short Story, numerous articles on Mark Twain, Melville, Whitman. Now, what we're doing today is a discussion of Huckleberry Finn. What makes Huckleberry Finn a great American novel? When published, it was widely criticized for its coarse language, a charge that continues to this day. Does the book's language undercut its attempts to challenge the entrenched attitudes of its day? Who influenced Twain's writing, and who did his writings influence? How would you describe his place in American literature? And I will add that for a great many of the books in this series, it's been, what makes this the great American novel, a great American novel, in fact, justify its place in the canon. Since the term was more or less invented for Huckleberry Finn, it may be an easier job to make the argument that it is a great American novel. And there's then, I think, the question, what has made it a great American novel in each generation, for each generation of audience, American and international? That would, I think, be my own particular little question to add to all this. Each speaker, alphabetical order, last name, will speak for 12 to 14 minutes. We will then have a discussion prompted by questions from you, the audience, in either the chat or the Q&A buttons. I moderate. The speakers can look at the questions themselves, can simply chat among each other. When I choose questions, it's simply, in whatever order makes for a fun conversation, not chronological. If your question doesn't happen to get answered in the course of the time between now and 3:30, don't worry. Send email to me, randall@nas.org, RANDALL, and I will forward your question to our participants so they can have the option to answer you. Your question should get answered no matter what. And if you have to leave early, this is being recorded. It will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel in perpetuity within 24 hours. Having said all that, Dr. Breashears, may I ask if you would go first?
Yes, thank you for allowing me to join you in this conversation about Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It's one of the great American stories, partly because Twain's plot is so riveting, but also because it's full of characters who themselves are telling stories to each other and to the reader, and of course to themselves. Even at the beginning of the novel, we see that hilarious moment in which Tom Sawyer is so determined to live a life of significant action that he is interpreting Sunday school class picnic as this caravan of rich merchants with their elephants and gold, and they're going to go raid it and steal everything, right? So this storytelling trait is, as Jonathan Gottschall has argued in his really fabulous book, it captures something that's very, very human, and it's that we are storytelling animals. we love to tell stories. They are how we make sense of our lives. And so in one way, this is a timeless novel because it's about that human propensity. We're trying to entertain, we're trying to make exchanges, we're trying to empathize, we're trying to profit, and even develop moral judgment through our storytelling. One of Adam Smith's greatest insights in his theory of moral sentiments is that if you want to learn moral judgment, like virtues like love and friendship, you don't go to the Stoic philosophers, you go to novels. And Huck Finn is just the best example of that. At the same time, I think it's also a very timely novel because the ways in which the characters tell stories can cause harm by omitting critical information and by reinforcing problematic fictions. And in that sense, Huck Finn is relevant to our national conversations where we see problematic stories causing a lot of damage. So let me start with the good. Huck Finn, of course, has an identity before he starts spinning yarns, but telling his story helps him make sense of who he is and the decisions he has made over this period of his life. So, for instance, why is he working so hard to protect Jim when he has been brought up to think of Jim as Miss Watson's property, right? What is that inner moral compass that guides him right when society says what he's doing is wrong? Telling this story helps him work out what he has done and why he's done it, even if he thinks it's wrong. And we see that process in his mental thoughts, right? And we're rooting for him and we see him make the right choices. And it's a beautiful thing. We also see how Huck's storytelling frees him. And again, this is a very powerful point because he is the son of a very abusive father. And so he frees himself by telling this story, by plotting essentially his own murder and laying it out for his father and other people to read. And so they come upon this scene and conclude that he has been murdered. And of course, everybody goes out to the river to try to find his body. And we see similar examples when he protects Jim, for instance, when people are coming to the raft and he's heading them off by saying, oh, my father is sick, right? He's storytelling in a way that provides freedom. When Huck finds Jim on the island, storytelling also creates empathy, right? Huck tells his story of how he escaped from his father. And then as soon as he's done telling that, he turns to Jim and says, now tell me your story. What has happened to you, right? And this bond forms and he is loyal and does not betray Jim. And of course, Huck's storytelling enables him to gain information. And perhaps my favorite scene when he goes off trying to find information and he goes to a cottage of a woman and he pretends to be a girl. He's a terrible girl, right? He is Sarah Mary Williams and he can't keep his own name straight. But this is a way for him to find information. And even when he's caught, he quickly adapts because the woman that he encounters imposes her own story on him. And she says, oh, you must be a runaway apprentice. He's like, yep, you got me, I'm an apprentice, right? So the storytelling has a lot of really good benefits, but there are also a lot of bad ones. Okay. Perhaps one of the most obvious examples are the two scoundrels that they run into, the so-called Duke and the King, right? And the King, of course, is telling his story and he's like, why do you look so old? And he's like, well, I've gone through all these hardships, right? The gentleman before you that you see here in denim and misery is the Dauphin. He is the king, right? And of course, he's a crook, right? And he's a liar. He's a thief. He does terrible things. But these stories enable him to hoodwink people. Huck, of course, is not taken in by this. but it is a very effective ruse for some time. Another story that shows how people want particular stories that are often harmful is the case of Huck's father, Huck's pap. So when his father comes back and realizes, of course, that Huck is now rich, his father wants to resume his so-called parental duties, right? So he can have that money. And Judge Thatcher, of course, knows this is a ruse, but the new judge is taken in because the new judge and his family like these stories of someone who's just down on his luck and just needs a helping hand. And of course, this is the story that Huck's father tells. And, they cry, he gets the sympathy, they give him money, they give him a coat, they give him a beautiful room to live in. And of course, he exchanges the coat for a jug of 40 rod, gets really drunk, falls off the porch, breaks his leg, and that's the end of that story. So those kinds of stories can be harmful. Which brings us to the ugly storytelling. So we see a pattern of characters in this novel using existing stories, existing genres to structure the way in which they see their own lives. And this is just deadly, particularly in the case of the Grangerfords and the Shacklefords, the Shepherdsons, right? And Huck learns about this when he's staying with them, and Buck starts telling them about the feud. And all he knows about a feud is that it's glorious, that some man killed another man over a lawsuit and it went badly. And he doesn't remember exactly who was involved, how it got started, but he knows that they are mortal enemies and they have to kill each other off, okay? Because this is the glory of the whole thing. And so this vague story becomes a way of justifying the unjustifiable, of relentless, pointless murder. And the final example, of course, is the one that concerns us most because it's Tom's omission of a critical fact. At the end, Jim is free. He is a free man. And when Tom arrives, he withholds this information. And Jim is, of course, locked up in this shack as a supposed runaway slave. And instead of revealing it, Huck wants the adventure of the Count of Monte Cristo. He wants this glamorous adventure in which he can help Jim escape, and Jim is a hero, and Jim gets this glory. And so he spins this complicated story, right, where he's got a coat of arms for Jim, and poor Jim is trying to inscribe these mournful sentiments onto a rock, and they're trying to dig him out of the cottage. And as a result, Jim suffers horribly for weeks, and Tom even gets shot, right? And this is the very ugly, because they really seriously endangered Jim. So this is where I think Huck Finn is really relevant to our time, because our country is, of course, fractured. And part of this is due to conflicting beliefs, but it's also because of the stories used to reinforce beliefs, okay? And those are promoted through our institutions. They are promoted through institutions indirectly as well as directly related to higher education. We see these, for instance, in descriptions of whiteness, for instance, that the Smithsonian posted and took down, associating whiteness with rationality and timeliness and forethought. They've removed that sense, but we see these kinds of very harmful stories being promoted, and they're not helping our students. They are in fact harming them and dividing them, and in fact forcing them into boxes that are just as mentally restrictive as Jim's cottage was imprisoning to him. So we need to be really conscious about the stories we tell and the truths that we tell that enable our students to flourish and to find their freedom and to achieve what they can individually. We need stories that affirm the value of being human. And I'll tell a story about this of my own. Last semester, I was teaching a dystopian novel course. And when we got to the matrix, we got to that part of the matrix in which Mr. Smith says that humans are a virus upon this planet. A quarter of my students agreed with that sentiment. Okay. Is that really what we want our students to get out of higher education? So our stories matter. And Huck Finn is one of the great American stories, not just because it's a great plot, but also because it's partly about storytelling and the good ones and the bad ones and the ones that are very harmful. I think it's a story we need because it shows a key quality that Adam Smith says lies at the root of great criticism and morality, and that is common sense. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much. Wonderful. May I now go in alphabetical order? Dr. Gribben.
Thank you, David. That was excellent, Carolyn. And I'm wanting to start at a place that backs things up just a little bit. It's very comforting to nations to have a national literature, to have what we call classics. A classic is a work that outlives its own time, but in the same point, we professional commentators, and sometimes the public as well, choose these things together, and we make mistakes. For example, Moby Dick, now recognized as a complete national classic, was completely ignored for the better part of 70 or 80 years. We forgot all about Moby Dick. Sister Carrie by Theodore Dreiser was considered too obscene and radical to be accepted initially. Mistakes are made. Huckleberry Finn has never been as well and completely accepted as, let's say, Washington Irving's short stories, or Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, or The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. It simply has never had the unanimous approval of each generation. I recently went through the criticisms of each decade. I thought you might be interested that the even in its own first few decades after publication, Huckleberry Finn was seen as too uncouth, too rough, too ungrammatical, and the characters were dismissed as seedy by a significant proportion of readers. By the 1920s, oddly enough, Twain was faulted for having been too popular, too much of a celebrity to qualify as a serious artist. Now, the public, let me just say, went on reading Huckleberry Finn, no matter what these professional critics were saying. But there has been, as I want to stress, this undercurrent from the very beginning, a rumble of dissatisfaction with the novel. In the 1930s, a significant number of critics felt that it was far too humorous a work to mirror the suffering of the masses during the Depression. In the 1940s and 1950s, these decades were obsessed with form and the perfection of form, and Huckleberry Finn, by many literary commentators, was seen as far too imperfect, too disjointed to qualify as a masterpiece. In the 1960s, it wasn't viewed as sufficiently interested in national conflicts. In the 1970s and 1980s, Well, the ending came under fire. It was far too weak to qualify as a true masterpiece. And in 1970, in fact, one professional commentator even tried to rectify the matter by publishing another version of Huckleberry Finn that lopped off the ending and changed a few other things. Huck uses real swear words, for example. And it was called The True Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But now it's been half a century since that experiment came out, and who reads The True Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by John Seeley? It sits dusty on the library shelves. In the 1990s, as feminist criticism rose to the fore, I kind of got the feeling that it was faulted simply for not having been written by a woman. And now in the 21st century, we find two charges against it repeatedly. Of course, the dreaded N-word and the sense that enslavement is mixed in with comedy, and that doesn't seem to take enslavement seriously enough. One scholar even made something of a name for himself by urging that classrooms instead switch to Harry Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in place of Huckleberry Finn. As a matter of fact, I was one of those who tried that, and Uncle Tom's Cabin is a well-written book and a work of genius, and it certainly had a tremendous impact in its day, and a lasting one and a good one. But it's more of a historical artifact today, or so my students seem to feel. Huckleberry Finn is that transition point between the prose of Hawthorne and Poe and the switch to the realist movement. It might interest our listeners to remember that Mark Twain himself had problems writing this novel. For one thing, it was daring in a way that we would have trouble appreciating today, but believe me, I've spent a lot of my life reading 19th century literature, and I can assure you that nearly all post-Civil War writers were careful to avoid any mention of the word enslavement, slavery, or slaves. The North was just sick of the subject, having lost so many tens of thousands of soldiers in the war. The South didn't want to hear about it anymore because the practice had brought devastation and economic ruin on the region. And so you see in all of the short stories and novels of the time references to servants or cooks or whatever, but not to enslave people. So Twain was being quite daring and taking quite a risk to make enslavement such a big part of his novel. For an author who sold his books door to door and really counted on and was very much into profit for his artistry, this was a very daring experiment. Another problem I'd like to mention, and there were others, but I'll just stop with this, is that Mark Twain couldn't figure out why an enslaved man would head south on the river instead of north, but he had to get Jim moving south with Huck in order to get to the region that he, Mark Twain, as a youth, had been a river pilot on. He wanted to use his knowledge of the river down there, and he solved it very ingeniously, two different ways, but it took him 8 years to figure out how to fix it. He had the raft drift past Cairo, Illinois in the fog, and that got it farther down the river. And then he finally had a burst of inspiration, and he had two rascals who call themselves the Duke and the King jump aboard the raft and take command of the raft. And being white adults, they can order Huck around and order Jim around, and they move the raft farther south. Despite all these problems, and despite all the concerns that critics have had with this novel, Mark Twain made two revolutionary breakthroughs in this work that were worth all of his worries. First of all, he switched from the third person narration of that he'd used in Tom Sawyer. Tom went home quite cheerful. Huck was always willing to take a hand. And he switched to first person narration so that Huck was saying, I lit a pipe, then I got a shovel. And that altered everything altogether. But the greatest feat he achieved was that this boy, Huckleberry Finn, is so young, he doesn't truly, because of his lack of experience, doesn't truly comprehend most of the things he's seen. For example, when he sneaks into a circus, he's just overwhelmed by the costumes that the acrobats are wearing. He says this one lady had on a costume of pure diamonds, and he's taken in by a routine circus act. He thinks it's spontaneous, the way the clown and the ringmaster trade witty repartee. And we readers have to interpret that scene and lots of other scenes. We have to say, no, that's just a routine act, even for this little one-ring circus. And those were sequins, not diamonds on our costume. We're always translating. And the fact that the burden of interpretation lies on us is what gives the novel its emotional power. We're investing in the novel. That's why Ernest Hemingway said this was the first truly modern novel. It's because the reader leans in and does the interpreting instead of having the author tell us at the end of the chapter or the end of the book what we just read and add it all up for us. The author doesn't do the job here because the boy's not equipped to do it. There is a lot of comedy in the novel, some of which I think today isn't fully appreciated. Perhaps we're not in the mood for it, but this is a picaresque travel story. And it's written, if you think about it, in the form of an epistolary novel. That is, at the end of it, Huckleberry Finn signs his letter, yours truly, Huck Finn. So we got the picturesque and the epistolary novel, two forms that in the 18th century English authors developed for adult characters. And that's supposed to be funny in itself. I mean, that a boy is doing this. I mean, but I think a lot of readers miss that point. And then Carolyn's touched on some of this, but there's just comedy throughout. The king goes to a camp meeting and cons the people into donating to a project to reform pirates. A mindless mob descends on a cemetery to dig up Peter Wilkes' coffin and see what's in it. The ending is supposed to be funny, but it kind of falls flat for many readers today. There, Twain was sort of depending on people continuing to be interested in what we might call dungeon literature, like The Count of Monte Cristo or The Man in the Iron Mask. But not that many people are familiar with the books that he was depending on there. And so a lot of readers don't see the full extent of the intended comedy there. Well, one could say that was a failing because a book should be able to carry its own weight decade in and decade out. But I did try an experiment once. I photocopied off all of the dungeon literature that Mark Twain was depending on his readers knowing there, and I showed it to my students. I had them read it in advance, and then I had them read the novel. And by golly, my students thought the ending was hilarious. They gave it thumbs up all the way. It's a very unsentimental novel. So you have comedy, and then as Carolyn pointed out, a lack of sentiment. Perhaps alcoholism can't be cured by the good intentions of an idealistic new judge. Criminals drown on a wrecked steamboat. The Shepherdsons and the Grangerfords die inevitably and tragically in that mindless feud that they've nursed. Colonel Sherburne shoots a harmless drunk and gets away with it. An enslaved family is casually torn apart and sold separately by the king and the duke. And yet later, there's an instance of tar and feathering, which, if you know anything about that process, is quite dangerous and sometimes fatal. So the novel has a lot of things that if we would slow down a bit, I think we could see more in it. But the public continues to read it. It's never been out of print. It's not likely to go out of print. We're struggling with some things in it today, but we've had that same struggle for a long time. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to say one question already from the audience. What was the list of literature Alan shared with his students to prepare them to read Huckleberry Finn? I'm just going to say right now, if you don't have it immediately available, if you would send it to us later, then we can put it on our website so people can see it. I think that'll be a real service. So I interest you in doing that.
Well, I edited an edition of Huckleberry Finn, and it's in that edition. It's published by New South. If anybody's interested, but I'll also give the list to you.
Thank you.
It's about 7 things that in his day and age, a lot of people were reading, not just Dumas's novels, but some things that were just in the current in that era, and now we drop them.
Thank you. Dr. Lamb, I interrupted just to reply to that person. Would you be so kind as to give our third talk?
Sure, I'm just setting my watch so I can time it. Okay. And I apologize. Let's see. Just set my view. Here we go. I apologize in advance for this light. I still haven't figured out how to get light on my notes as I'm working. So, today I'm going to address the question of why Mark Twain is so significant. But I do hope we'll have a chance later to discuss race in Huck Finn because it's so badly misunderstood. Mark Twain is the most important, culturally rich, and influential author America has ever produced, and he arguably possessed the greatest pure imagination in world literature. In his fiction and essays, he addressed nearly every major issue of his time: race, politics, imperialism, democracy, foreign relations, oligarchy, class inequality, labor strife, social injustice, social injustice, the law, the South, the Western frontier, corruption in Washington, childhood, the construction of gender, and human nature. And his representations of those issues were so insightful that they remain as relevant today as they were in his own day. It would take me the rest of the week to list his many renowned and very eclectic admirers, but to give you some idea, they include Frederick Douglass, Ulysses S. Grant, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Charles Darwin, who kept Twain's books by his bedside and read them before going to sleep every night, Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, William James, the father of Cuban independence, Jose Marti, Friedrich Nietzsche, Joseph Conrad, George Bernard Shaw, the founder of modern Chinese literature, who did for Chinese literature what Twain did for American literature, Lu Xun, Theodore Dreiser, Helen Keller, Gertrude Stein, the greatest writer in the Spanish-speaking world since Cervantes, Jorge Luis Borges, T.S. Eliot, W.H. Auden, Langston Hughes, George Orwell, Jean Cocteau, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, and Barack Obama. William Dean Howells, who was the major person of letters in the late 19th century, called Twain the Lincoln of our literature. Ernest Hemingway wrote, "All modern American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn." Eugene O'Neill called him the true father of all American writers. And William Faulkner stated, "He is, for all of us, our grandfather." Twain also crucially influenced generations of social satirists like H.L. Mencken, Lenny Bruce, Dick Gregory, Richard Pryor, and George Carlin. Also, Jon Stewart, whose use of juxtaposition, impersonation, parody, irony, self-effacing humor, and recently even volcanic anger is right out of the Mark Twain handbook. Dick Gregory, for those of you who know, Dick Gregory was a stand-up comic and then a major social satirist. He's a huge figure. Dick Gregory wrote, Twain was so far ahead of his time that he shouldn't even be talked about on the same day as other people. Dismissing the use of the N-word in Huck Finn, Gregory wrote, quote, "We black folks were always human to each other, but Twain's Jim made us human to white folks." All major African-American authors have always concurred with this. Toni Morrison stated, "Mark Twain wrote about race and racial ideology in the most powerful, eloquent, and instructive way I have ever read." Twain is an incredibly and possibly complex man whose inner divisions fueled and deepened and enriched his writings. He was a Midwesterner who moved to the frontier, a Southerner who moved to New England, the quintessential American who spent over a decade living abroad, a vagabond who married the daughter of wealthy Elmira abolitionists and became a Victorian gentleman. He was the single foremost champion of American progress in the 19th century, and also their most bitter and effective critic. Idealist and cynic, a dreamer and pragmatist, believer and skeptic, Twain was a person of gargantuan contradictions. Twain's art emerged from his having a foot in both the worlds of vernacular oral culture and of genteel written culture. His roots in vernacular oral culture lay in his mastery of Southwestern folklore and humor with its anecdotes, burlesques, tall tales, and jokes, of African-American slave culture, which, by the way, he knew like the back of his hand, with its double-voiced discourse in which the same words spoken or written would be understood one way by part of the audience and in a completely different way by another part. His memorized public lectures and performances, he was always on the lecture trail, usually because he blew his money. And the memorized science of piloting riverboats, which if you read the first part of Life on the Mississippi, it's a lot easier to get a PhD in nuclear physics than to do that. His roots in written culture came from his profession since the age of 12 as a printer and a news reporter. His self-taught, his schooling ended when his father died at 12. He's completely self-taught. His self-taught learning of French and German, his wide reading of medieval, Renaissance, 19th century literature, Shakespeare, the Bible, and his favorite novel, Don Quixote, the picaresque that helped him with his own form. Twain knew Renaissance literature better than a lot of scholars of Renaissance literature. And to give a sense of his range, I'd like now just to take a look at a few of his key books. In 1869's The Innocents Abroad, Twain travels through Europe to the Holy Land and creates the image, the actual first, the ugly American abroad. But at the same time, brilliantly satirizes revered old world institutions and punctures the awe and reverence Americans felt toward them. In 1872's Roughing It, the single funniest serious book ever written, based on his own experiences as a reporter and miner in Nevada, California, and Hawaii. He pits Eastern civilization against the Old West. His satire cuts both ways as he discovers that Western freedom is anarchy and Eastern order is oppression, both equally soul-destroying. Moreover, the West has been taken over by mining conglomerates and is becoming just like the East, with corporate concentrations of wealth and an impoverished proletariat at their mercy. The book is predictive, as violent class conflicts of the late 19th century, labor wars, are just around the corner. Twain has a way of writing something that predicts what happens 100 years later. He just continually does this. In his co-authored 1873 The Gilded Age, a book that gave its name to the historical period, Twain lampoons popular sentimental novels and launches a blistering critique of the myth of American mobility and an unbelievably savage attack on corruption in Washington, which if you picked it up and read the book today, you would think was written today. In 1876, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, ostensibly a children's book, Twain turned his guns on and anatomized the hypocrisy of the cherished American images of the small town, the family, the legal profession, the educational system, religion, the myth of success, and American individualism. And at the same time performs a critique of masculinity, how boys and girls are trained to assume the conventional gender roles of men and women. Something he was very sensitive to. This is the father of 3 daughters. 1883's Life on the Mississippi is Twain's love letter to his river and the profession he loved more than any other, piloting, with the Mississippi being the book's real protagonist. As James Cox observes, 2 styles coexist in this book. The first is reportorial clarity, direct, clear, factual, and detailed depictions and descriptions. The second is humorous deviation, outlandish vernacular exaggeration, deadpan hoaxes, satire, parody, burlesque, and impersonation. These 2 styles, so completely different, effectively expose things for what they are. The former forces the reader to see with perfect accuracy. The latter explodes things through caricature. Now, had he not written Huckleberry Finn, 1889's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court would be the Twain novel assigned in all school curricula. One can view it from so many different perspectives. It's a pioneering work in time travel science fiction. It's both a celebration and a savage critique of 19th century beliefs in moral and technological progress. It's an anatomy of the process of imperialism written at the height of worldwide imperialism. It's a dystopia written in the age of utopian novels. It's an example of literary naturalism that predates the actual naturalists. And it's a stunningly predictive novel on the coming of the 20th century with its technology-based modern warfare, the rise of secular dictators, the use of propaganda, and campaigns of genocide. In German and Italian editions, Hank Morgan's title, The Boss, is translated as Der Führer and Il Duce. On a lighter note, FDR took the name The New Deal from this, his favorite novel. In the character of Hank, Twain also created literature's first postmodern subject, a century before postmodernism came on the scene. Hank is an uncentered self who is nothing more than a site upon which different ideologies inscribe themselves. For instance, Hank is a racist, an imperialist, and a genocidal maniac. And he's also an egalitarian Democrat, 19th century liberal, and social reformer. In showing how liberal egalitarianism can lead to imperialism and genocide. When you cannot win the hearts and minds of the people, Twain explained a great deal about American foreign policy over the past 100 years. In 1894's Pudd'nhead Wilson, his most drippingly ironic novel, Twain went past critiquing racism and became the first author ever to deconstruct the very notion of race itself, what his third-person narrator calls, quote, a fiction of law and custom, unquote, without any basis in biology. For Twain, race was a shared historical experience, and he shattered the idea of white people and Black people. Even at the height of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, no one had caught up to him on that. In fact, we have still yet to catch up to him. Last, in the posthumously published number 44, The Mysterious Stranger, Twain anticipated the dreamscapes and explorations of the unconscious that would later become central to modernist fiction. I'd like to now make just 2 points about Huck Finn. I'm 427 pages into completing a book on this novel, so obviously there's a lot I'd like to say, but I was addressing Twain's importance, and now I get to finally talk about Huck Finn. First, although Twain often in his writing demonstrated that he could write prose passages of unsurpassing conventional beauty that would rival anyone, in Huck Finn he chose to place the vernacular with its focus on the actual, its use of everyday languages. There are 13 dialects in that book, and they're done perfectly. And its inherent democratic ideology. He placed the vernacular over genteel literary language with its focus on the ideal and desire to ennoble. For Mark Twain, truth was beauty, not beauty was truth. This decision of Twain's would influence all future American and world fiction. In Twain, as in life, voice and ideology are inseparable. Huck Finn is hegemonically formed by the three worlds of Pap, the widow, and Tom and the boys. And when he speaks like one of these worlds, he is viewing events from their perspective. But in the great chapter 31, when he decides not to return Jim to Miss Watson, but instead to steal him out of slavery, a felony, he repeats nearly verbatim Jim's own words from chapter 16. If he's speaking like Jim, he's thinking like Jim. In this scene that is, I would argue, the zenith of morality in American literature. My last point, my second point, because I see time is running out, is about race in the novel, which I hope we can return to later. Because Twain's first-person narrator is a prepubescent racist boy in the slave South, Twain was barred from commenting on anything in his own voice. But he found other methods of authorial presence. I won't go into all of them. His main method, though, was this. Huck is the most prolific liar in American literature. But here's the key thing. Toward the reader, he is totally honest. He's almost confessional about his thoughts and feelings. He doesn't lie to us. His depictions of Jim's actions and Jim's actual quoted speech are accurate. But there is a huge discrepancy between Huck's assessment of these and what should be the reader's assessment. For instance, when Huck is shocked that Jim says he'll steal his own children from the man who owns them, Twain expects the reader to know that Jim has a right to his own children. I mean, if you're a 13-year-old racist kid in the antebellum South, if that's your perspective, then Twain can't do anything for you. He expects more from you. For his part, as did so many slaves, Jim wears what we call the minstrel mask. He reflects back to Huck and white people their own racial stereotypes, that slaves are gullible, simple-minded, childlike, docile, superstitious, lazy, without guile, inclined to small thefts, and loyal. But from behind that mask, Jim continually manipulates Huck for self-protection and his own purposes. Just a few examples are Jim cleverly extracting Huck's promise not to tell on him before he reveals that he's run away. Jim preventing Huck from seeing the dead pap in the floating house, for then Huck would return home and Jim wouldn't have Huck to claim him as his owner. Jim playing dumb about Huck's snake prank that gets Jim bitten, and instead bringing up the superstition of Huck's having earlier touched a snakeskin as the cause of bad luck. Now, whenever he wants to make Huck feel guilty about the snake prank, he just has to bring up the snake's skin. Jim manipulating Huck's conscience so they can continue to forage. Jim keeping Huck, in his greatest use of the mask in chapter 16, Jim keeping Huck from handing him over to the slave hunters by threatening to tell on him from behind a mask of feigned gratitude, flattering him, reminding him of both their friendship and his earlier promise not to tell. Jim colluding with Huck's slave Jack at the Grangerfords to bring Huck to him, while Jack maintains plausible deniability. Jim informing on the King and the Duke. It's Jim who informed on him and got them ridden out of town, tarred and feathered on a rail. Jim conspiring with the Phelps slave Nat to bring Huck and Tom to him. And Jim feigning fidelity by remaining with Tom after the boy is shot, knowing that there's no escape. And by playing the faithful slave, he keeps himself from being lynched or beaten by the mob. You simply cannot begin to understand Jim or this novel without being aware of Jim's employment of the minstrel mask. Unfortunately, only a minuscule percentage of teachers who assign Huck Finn are so aware. Thank you.
Thank you very, oh, yeah, sorry, yes. Thank you very much.
I finished.
Yeah, it just took me a second to get my video and mute undone. All right, so thank you so very much, all of you. Now, oh golly, bunch of questions. I'm going, and I got to push on them. So one from Mike Goodman, to what extent is Huck Finn based on Mark Twain's actual experiences in Hannibal and St. Petersburg? From other accounts I've read, Mark Twain experienced or witnessed many instances of great violence while growing up. And I guess I want to push that a question. There's a question, what artistry consists both of, the relatively, transparent window of rendering experience and what you make of that experience. What parts of the artistry in Huckleberry Finn are in the plain rendition of the facts? What elements of the artistry are in how it then arranges them?
Do you want me? Well, a lot is transmuted, but I can give you one scene when Colonel Sherburne kills Boggs in the streets. That's based on an actual incident in Hannibal that Twain witnessed, where a man named William Owsley was being harassed by this fellow Sam Smarr, and he did exactly what Boggs did, and he shot him down in the street. But Twain puts those words, he puts that incident into Huck Finn for another purpose. He makes Boggs, the original Sam Smarr was a wealthy beef dealer. He makes Boggs this sort of poor white trash. And one of the reasons why he does that is he's depicting what went on in the South. These small towns were very, very violent. Twain witnessed young Sam Clemens witnessed an enormous amount of violence growing up. And he wanted to make a huger class disparity between Sherburne and Boggs. And that whole scene where the lynch mob comes out to get Boggs, that is the one scene in the entire book that could not have occurred in the time of the narration, which is 1845 mainly. That's a reference. First of all, he takes Sherburne's words out of his own mouth in Life in Mississippi, puts them in Sherburne's mouth, and he says, when you come, you'll bring your mask, you 100 masked cowards. That's a reference to the present in the Ku Klux Klan. And it sets up the ending as a representation of post-Reconstruction, not just in 1845. But yeah, there's an example where he takes an incident that he experienced as a kid and transmutes it into an incident in this book.
Thank you. Do anybody else want to respond to this as well? Okay, anybody else want to respond to this as well?
No, I can give you the sources that Mark Twain counted on people. If you wanted just a few examples of the dungeon literature. I was looking those up. William Ainsworth's The Tower of London, Thomas Carlyle's The French Revolution, Baron Friedrich von Trink's life, all these Casanova's memoirs, Benvenuto Cellini's life. All these were dungeon literatures. Joseph Santine's Picciola. That's a novel in which a prisoner retains his sanity by nourishing and watering a seed that fell through a window into a crack in the dungeon floor, and a flower grows, and that's all that keeps his sanity in this dungeon in which he's cast. And Jim is urged by Tom to grow a flower, to give you one example. And there were others, but gives you an idea of what Twain too glibly assumed his readers would be familiar with. Now, where Mark Twain depends on literature, for example, in the Shakespeare ridiculous, garbled speeches of the king and the duke, we still read Shakespeare, so that works great, where they're pretending like they're acting Shakespeare plays. That works for us, but the dungeon literature is tougher for modern readers to appreciate the comedy going on there.
I'd also add another thing to that. One of my grad students published a wonderful article on this, Aaron DeRosa. Tom gets everything wrong about that literature. He has no clue as to what he's reading.
He's reading above his level, you might say.
Yeah.
Dr. Breashears, did you want to answer that question also, like, artistries of experience and arrangement of experience? Oh, and you're muted, I should say. Okay.
Oh, you're muted, Carol.
I think Professor Lamb and Professor Gribben have covered it beautifully.
All right. So I had a question from Paul Klein. How was Huck Finn received by the Northern and Southern press? And I must say, how was it received by the Missouri press? I'd love to know what they thought of it back home. For any or all of you.
Well, one of Twain's purposes in portraying boyhood in the 1840s was to kind of get around the fact that his war record was less than stellar, shall we say, as he had decamped for the desert and in California to get away from the war. So he very cleverly was kind of pitching things back to, remember when we were all boys and the shenanigans that we used to get involved in and so forth. And it actually worked to a pretty good extent. It leaped over the Civil War and put it off to the side as kind of irrelevant. And also Twain didn't have to get into the fact that he hadn't participated in the great cultural and military event of his lifetime.
How much is it a literature of nostalgia? That is, how much is it evoking aside from the obviousness, this is, a slave society, slavery is gone, but how much is it evoking a boyhood that is gone? Is it already a sense, this is a freer life than, we slaves of modern life in, the 1880s in, New York or Indianapolis are having? Is it already this sense of a bygone era of freedom, or, yeah, everybody's, every kid is this free still?
There's a tremendous amount of nostalgia that runs through a lot of Twain's works. At the same time, he always exposes it as nostalgia. he's continually doing that. And also the nostalgia changes. For instance, when you go south on the Mississippi, in the old times in the Mississippi, he published in 1875 for the Atlantic, and it's all about young Sam being apprenticed to the great Horace Bixby and learning to be a pilot. He leaves out the fact that he was actually one of the 6 best full pilots on the Mississippi at the time the war broke out. And then the rest of it is Mark Twain, the world-renowned Mark Twain, returning to the Mississippi for the first time in 21 years. And it's a travelogue. Well, there's a particular point called, that's dangerous on the southern Mississippi as you're in Louisiana and you're approaching the big sugar plantations. And he doesn't like it in the first part because it's dangerous to navigate there. When he returns, he doesn't like it and describes it as pure hell because that's the deep south of slavery. So you see it going from, in this one book, you see that region going from, how can I put this? You know, the concern is with piloting and the romance of piloting. And 21 years later, the concern is, this is the ugly deep south of slavery. This is hell. So, and he does that in Roughing It too, where he gets nostalgic after the mining towns are over and they're all ghost towns. But he's already shown what they were really like. And he does that in virtually all his novels. Whenever he gets nostalgic and sentimental, he then undercuts it. But he does have that streak in him. Yeah, but I want to get away from this notion of, you know, I mean, people do imitations of Mark Twain and they always start with, when I was a boy, you know, that's not really who he is.
Twain's 2 boy books, which, by the way, it should be remembered, he intended to be conjoined and read together. And the first sentence of Huckleberry Finn says, you don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Twain's 2 boy books can also be seen in the whole subgenre of boy books. And boy books were modeled on Thomas Hughes' Tom Brown School Days, an English novel, and they went back to boyhood and the adventures of boys. And Twain's novels were in that very vein, and most authors, William Dean Howes, Charles Dudley Warner, Thomas Aldrich especially, and all the authors that Mark Twain was familiar with, they were all writing these boy books in the 1870s and 1880s and even 1890s, recapturing their boyhood, partly because it was pre-Civil War and everyone agreed the war had changed America forever. But also it was selling well. People really were enjoying this. And what happened was, I like to say Mark Twain was up there in that little octagon study that his relatives built for him on a hillside outside of Elmira, New York. And he started another boy book, and lightning struck his pen, and he wrote something that became a classic and stood out from all the other so-called boy books. So we don't even think of it as a boy book or in that following that subgenre, but it really is part of that. And as Robert was saying, it's very nostalgic and intended to be so. And then that was the paying element in it, was heavy on nostalgia.
I have a question to follow up. I must say, it's by free association from Dr. Breashears talking about Adam Smith. To what extent is it the development of an individual learning to set himself apart from society? I mean, how should I put this? Is Twain, among his other lessons, preaching indeed, that part of the education of, that you learn as a child is how to have individual judgment? and not simply defer your judgment to your neighbors, your peers, to public opinion.
I'm deferring to Carolyn on that one.
I would agree. We see some of that in Huck Finn, but it's narrated by Huck, and so we're getting his thoughts. And because he's telling that story, of course, he's having to evaluate what he's done, right, and try to make sense of that. And I think the sort of process of reflection, right? So the act of writing something down forces you to get that kind of distance that Smith would call the sort of impartial spectator process, where you're kind of stepping outside of yourself and looking back at yourself, your previous self, your earlier self, what that self did, and trying to enter into that situation, knowing the full circumstances, and then making that kind of judgment call. And so I would agree with what you were suggesting, David, about how this is working in relation to Smith's idea of moral judgment.
Dr. Lamb?
Twain's all about, we're talking about overcoming hegemony. And for those of you who don't know, hegemony can best be described as the way all of us internalize our cultural values. And they sink down so low, we take it for granted that they're true. In fact, we think it came from us. Hegemony exists everywhere. We all experience it. But if your culture is the slave South or 13 years of Nazi culture in Germany, then that hegemony is going to be a bad thing. And Twain was all about, as he himself did, with Huck, trying to overcome hegemony. Just before he's about to turn Jim in, and I always have to have my book with me, just before he's about to turn Jim in chapter 16, and he intends to turn Jim in. If Jim doesn't make those 2 speeches, he tells you he's going to turn him in. So this is not in doubt. Huck, as Twain before him, launches into an attack on conscience. And he says, I've begun to get it through my head that he was most free. And who was to blame for it? Why, me. I couldn't get them out of my conscience. No way, no how. And he goes on about how, he tries to soften it up by thinking like Pap, that I'm not to blame. But he says, but it were no use. Conscience up and says every time, but you knew this. Conscience says to me, and conscience and conscience and conscience. Well, we think of conscience as a good thing, don't we? Let your conscience be your guide. Have you, sir, no conscience? Conscience is nothing more than hegemony. And it's everything in his culture telling him that what he's doing is wrong. That's what conscience is. This is the boy, and Twain didn't have terms like hegemony, but in talking about Huck Finn on the lecture tour, he famously said, this is about a boy with a sound heart and a deformed conscience. Twain's all about that. And I don't know how to do this. So for my classes, I brought this along. This is Huck's mind, okay? Twain is the only author I know who continually changed his notion of the human self. I mean, he starts out with the romantic egoist. Then he's one of the people creating the realist, socially constructed subject. Then he has a naturalist subject. Then he anticipates a postmodern subject. And in the end, he comes up with the notion that human beings are nothing more than machines, or that it's all a dream. But at the time he wrote Huck Finn, this is Huck's consciousness, okay? Part of it's formed by the world of the widow. Part of it's formed by the world of Pap, and part of it's formed by Tom and the boys. But there is a little inner thing that is uniquely Huck Finn that cannot be accounted for, that is autonomous, and that is capable of moral agency. The story of this book is how, despite constantly thinking like Pap, the widow, and Tom, how Huck manages, the inner core in him responds to Jim in that wonderful chapter 31 and rises up and overwhelms all of this hegemonic influence. You know, I have another thing for you. If you put a scale when Huck makes his decision, on the right is everything. I don't know if you can see this. All three of his worlds, the legal system, God, okay, you name it. Everything is on the right or on your left. And the only thing on the left, on the other side, is Jim. Amazingly, Jim wins. And amazingly, Twain makes this scene so believable that with all the criticism this book has had over the years, nobody's ever said, oh, come on, Jim, a kid wouldn't do that. And he made it believable. But Twain was too realistic to think that anyone completely can shed hegemony. Two things. One is he does extend it to some other slaves. He extends it to the Wilkes slaves, but mainly he makes an exception for Jim. And the other thing is at the end, you know, Huck has made this exception for Jim. Huck is, you know, when Huck rips up the letter and goes to save Jim and says, all right, I will go to hell, he means a Presbyterian hell of eternal damnation and torment. That's the hell he's talking about. And he's willing to do it. But in the end, that individual decision doesn't matter because he's dealing with the world of Tom Sawyer and the Phelpses. And Jim is going to be, even as a free man, returned to the conditions of race in America. So this book is all about overcoming all of this, as Twain did.
Are there? I see your Dr. Gribben, your finger. Dr. Breashears, your finger. Dr. Gribben, your finger first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, people often forget that Mark Twain had an older brother, Orion, and Orion was an abolitionist in attitude and even had to move out of Missouri for his own safety. Mark Twain, as a boy, Samuel Clemens, chose to follow his father's advocacy of slavery and was loyal to that way into, and some would say even after the Civil War, was loyal to the Confederate cause. Therapists often try to deal with people's guilt and try to assuage or help people lose their guilt. In this case, I would submit guilt was a good thing. It produced a classic. Mark Twain's guilt over having been so mistaken about that institution gave us a novel that is lasting well into its second century here.
Dr. Breashears?
Professor Lamb, I love your diagrams. Those are so fabulous. And I especially like the round one where you have that, we see the influences on Huck, and then we have that little court in the middle. And what's interesting from a sort of Smithian perspective is that Smith says, you know, the way we learn moral judgments from when we're young is society. Society is that mirror. Yeah. Right. And we are reflecting back what we see, right? Like if you grew up without society, it would be hard for you to develop any kind of moral judgment. And so I love the way you've broken down the way in which Huck's judgments are shaped partly by what he's mirroring, but at the same time, he's like on his way to develop his own moral judgment. And so we have that little core in the middle, which is resisting what's happening. And so it's a beautiful way of capturing that moment of transition of a boy who's like not quite a man yet. I love that.
Thank you. The one thing I would say about Twain, I mean, Twain talked about this, that when he was a boy, he had the same sentiments on slavery. You know, twice a day, the steamboat would stop and slaves were chained on them, and he didn't think much of it. I think there are a number of things that changed him. One is his father was a taciturn, cold, and his father was a jerk who they say died of pneumonia, but probably died of venereal disease. But his mother was an extremely kind person. When he was a boy, there was a slave boy outside and he was singing. And young Sam, complained about the infernal racket, and his mother lectured him. And she said, that poor child has nothing to look forward to. He lives a life of toil. And if singing makes him happy and brings him some joy, then you have no right to complain about it. So there were influences along the way. And he did transition. I don't know if I would say he supported slavery after the war. I would say that he was not particularly sensitive to race. But then again, when you marry the daughter of prominent Elmira abolitionists who were part of the Underground Railroad, who helped Frederick Douglass escape from slavery, I think there's going to be some serious influence going on out there. And he'd also demonstrated sympathy toward other oppressed groups when he was a reporter in San Francisco toward the Chinese, who were treated horribly out there. So there were always those elements in him. I'd say he went from not really thinking about it to when he thought about it, he realized it was wrong. And by the way, thank God Orion was an abolitionist, because the reason Twain ended up in Nevada is President Lincoln made Orion the Secretary of Nevada when it was a territory. So young Sammy just traveled along with his brother.
I'm going to switch to a different question on a completely different subject. From Joseph Levin, what are the 13 dialects in Huck Finn? And I'm going to expand to that. So what is his artistry in representing all the dialects of American speech? And how should I put it? Can we learn what Americans spoke like then in ways we could not now, say for us, by the oldest of records?
Well, American culture has become very homogenized because of the media. Right after the Civil War, regionalism became very important because, before the war, people lived where they lived. And they knew there were other parts of the country, but they didn't really think about them. The war, in the war, the Ohio farmer fought side by side with the Irish stevedore. People from all walks of life and from around the country got to know each other. So after the war, there was a tremendous interest in a major magazine culture in how do people live elsewhere. A lot of Northerners stayed in the South for the same reason people retired to Florida. It's nice and warm. It's not so cold. And so there was less homogeneity in American language than there is today. Twain says, and is explanatory, because he has to explain why his characters are not all talking like, I love Moby Dick's my favorite novel, but they all talk like Shakespeare, okay? He has to explain to them this, and is explanatory before the novel starts. He says, in this book, a number of dialects are used, and then he mentions 7 of them. David Karkey, the linguist, has actually determined that there are 13. Twain wasn't giving himself enough credit. And then it says, the shadings have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly, and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. This is a realist manifesto. People in this book will speak the way actual people in this book speak. They're not all going to talk alike. Whenever Twain made a serious point, he often followed up with a joke. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. So with Twain, we get people talking the way actual people talk. And the differences back then in dialects were, there were a lot more dialects. They were pronounced. Now, television, for instance, has kind of, taken the edge off of this stuff. I'm a New York Jew, and I can do a great Alabama dialect, Florida dialect, white dialect. I went outside and a spider bit me. We've all kind of learned this stuff, so they've lost their distinctiveness. But in the time he was writing, it was a big deal.
And so you would say he's more creating our sense of dialect and building upon a dialect literary tradition?
Yeah, yeah. He does this the way, say, Zora Neale Hurston does this in Their Eyes Were Watching God. They are two of the best at writing in a way that you can actually sound out what the words sound like in that dialect. And that's important. That's important.
The earliest,
alive.
the earliest I've found experiments with African American dialect was in the 1840s publications. But by the time the Uncle Remus stories began to appear in 1880 and so forth, there was a great appetite, as Robert just said, across the nation for hearing through print, hearing the way different regions and different ethnic groups talk. I will note, and maybe it's just the students I've taught, but for the modern younger college readers, I think the dialect is an impediment today. They are impatient with it. It takes a while for them to get into it and begin to understand. I Glenn to do this and so forth. It is not a bright spot for many readers today. It was just as extremely delicious to the 19th century. They just couldn't get enough of this sort of writing. And Twain was, as Robert says, a master at reproducing it.
Thank you.
I'm from Arkansas, and I grew up with this novel, and we treasured every one of these different dialects. And I hear them right when I'm reading them, and I'm sorry to hear that your students are not enjoying them, because it's something that we are losing.
When you say we, do you mean in a class? Do you mean a family? Who's the we who is enjoying all of this?
Who are you asking?
Oh, Dr. Breashears.
Oh, me, my family, my classmates. Yes, I mean, we sounded like a lot of these characters, right? Or we knew someone.
I'm not talking about English majors. I'm talking about, I teach a lot. Up until a year or two ago, I taught a lot of survey courses, and I think for the average modern college student, the dialect was an impediment, an obstacle. I'm sorry if I disagree with everyone, but I had to grapple with that. I mean, I began to realize I was, it helped if I did what I just done and explained that at the time it was just seen as a tremendous breakthrough, and the way that we appreciate hearing the different dialects, on in television shows and so forth. But for a lot of students, they're impatient with it. The general student.
Reading it, they might be, but oftentimes, because I believe very strongly in close reading and not chatting, I want my students looking at the text and taking it apart. And so I'll read passages, and it may be hard for them to read, but I'm kind of good at doing these different dialects just by having to do them over again. And when they hear it read out loud, they're mesmerized the way Caroline was talking about. They're absolutely mesmerized by all the differences. Maybe that's the problem. When they're reading it themselves, they're not hearing it. But when they hear it, they absolutely, they just love it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one, I think, last question from Michelle Myers. What about religion informing societies? The role religion as a theme. You're talking about the predestination. How much is it a critique of, any particular denomination of American Protestantism? How much is it a special critique of American non-denominational, religious culture in general, or interdenominational of the 19th century? So how important is the religious critique in particular? How important is religion informing the world of Huck Finn?
Well, Twain was brought up a Presbyterian, which, if you know Presbyterianism, that's not a light religion. In 19th century Presbyterianism, well, as Twain put it, after reading Jonathan Edwards's Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, he said, I do believe that a perfectly sane person reading that late at night would almost have to go stark staring mad. He, at a fairly early age, stopped buying into it, and became rather irreligious. You'll notice in Huck Finn, Huck makes the observation, and by the way, the Shepherdsons and Grangerfords are based on actual family, two families, the Watsons and the Darnells. The church was on the border of half was in Tennessee, half was in Kentucky. He came across them when he was a pilot, and he brought them into the thing. And they go in there, and Huck describes it so beautifully. They put their guns on the side, and they listen to the preacher talk about the inoffensiveness of all to all. And then they go outside, and they take their guns, and they kill themselves. And then on the very next page, hogs come in because it's nice and cool in the church. He says, people don't feel, that comfortable in church, but I notice hogs do. He's constantly doing that. When Huck makes his great decision again in chapter 31, he has not gone to Sunday school, but he's been exposed to church. And Huck is like a sponge. He absorbs everything. Nothing is lost on this boy. And without Jim there to ascribe bad luck to the snakeskin, he finally realizes God is judging him. Providence is judging him. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden that here was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, while I was stealing a poor old woman's end that hadn't done me any harm. And he tries to soften it up through pap logic. I tried to bring it up to kind of soften it up somehow by saying I was brung up wicked and so I weren't much to blame. But then we go back to the widow's point of view, which is God. But something inside of me kept saying there was Sunday school, you could have gone to it. And he tries to pray. And he tries to pray. And he says, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide it from him, nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing and the clean thing and going right to that end's owner and tell where he was. But deep down in me, I knowed it was a lie, and he, God, knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. That is crucially important because Huck rejects God and religion. It's in the very beginning of the book. But all that time he's been brought to church, he's absorbed it. And unlike the other Christians in the book, he gets that you can't make your mouth say one thing when you're feeling another, that God sees it. The lie he can't pray is he doesn't want Jim to be a slave. And he can't make his mouth say it because God sees it. And if you want something really cool, Twain took this scene from when Claudius is trying to pray in Hamlet. I wish I had Claudius's actual speech where he's trying to do the same thing. Now, a great writer would be intertextual with Shakespeare, okay? But it would be a speech by one of Shakespeare's heroes. Mark Twain took a speech by the villain of Hamlet and turned it into a moral moment. So Twain believed in the real spirit of Christianity. He believed in the teachings of Christianity, but he didn't care much for the actual way it was practiced and was always lampooning the hypocrisy of Christians. And, we see that here. Twain had a lifelong, they say that Melville's lifelong argument with God, Twain had a lifelong argument with God too.
Dr. Gribben, Dr. Breashears, care to add to that? All right.
I think Professor Lance said it beautifully.
Well, it is 3:30. I think I would still like to ask if I could ask each of the three of you to give just a brief 1 minute or so conclusion, and then we'll just wrap this up. Reverse alphabetical order this time. Dr. Lamb, if you could go first.
Well, I don't quite know what to do. Well, I'll take something. The N-word, okay? Before 1865, the N-word was synonymous with slave. And it wasn't used oftentimes by wealthy slave owners and plantation owners, probably some residual guilt. They preferred the words workers and hands and servants to even the word slave. It was considered uncouth. It doesn't become an epithet until after the war, when if you use that word, what you're saying to someone is, I know you're free, but in my mind, you should be a slave. And then it develops into the word it was today. If you look at the way when Huck uses it and when he doesn't, he starts out using it, okay? But increasingly, whenever he's having a conflict with Jim, he'll use the word, or when Jim has become a burden to him, he wishes he could free himself from, he'll use the word. But at other moments, when he sees Jim's humanity, when he has kind feelings to him, he doesn't use the word. He refers to him as Jim. And Twain very carefully used that word as an index, aside from other characters like the Duke and the King, except when they're using it. When Huck uses it, he did this very strategically as a way of showing Huck's unconscious feelings toward Jim. And that's why that word is really, really important in the novel. He's also using it to make readers feel very, very uncomfortable. The word's not going to go away, and what it represents not going to go away if we don't use it. He's forcing you to see it. He's forcing you to confront it. As Cornel West said, it's the most important word in the book. So I'll leave with that.
Thank you. Dr. Gribben.
Well, to stay on the N-word for a minute, I really think it comes down to a matter of audience. I've been teaching for the last 28 years or so in the Deep South. My classes often have majority African-American students. I think this word is such a flash word today as to make the novel unteachable in many instances to general audiences. I'm not talking about graduate school. I'm not talking about perhaps upper level courses, but this is a word that is so insulting and has so many connotations today as to pose a great problem for the novel. And I think a lot of this is just sort of idle talk unless one has been in front of a very largely ethnically mixed classroom. I think the novel will survive. We're not talking about reading, the reading public. We're talking about compulsory classroom assignments, and we're in the middle here of a real problem. I think we would need to have another one of these seminars and address that. And I have quite a few things to say about it. And in fact, I've even edited an edition that changes the word, but it's a much larger issue than we have time for right now. But thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Dr. Breashears. Oh, and you're muted still.
All right, I appreciate what both of you are saying about that. I guess what I want to close with is that in spite of the challenges of teaching this book right now, it remains one of our great books about American literature and freedom and storytelling. And I hope that we can continue to work to find ways to introduce it to readers, because it is such a valuable piece of our heritage and has so many like amazing lessons about judgment and what it means to be free and good people. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all. Thank you all so much. Thank you to the audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. Let's see. So, and delighted to have you. Would love to have you listen to our next ones in the series, for which the next one is this very Friday. We are doing As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. We will be going on to other things such as Beloved in a few weeks. So it's a fine series that keeps on going. I encourage people who are interested in this and who don't yet know about the National Association of Scholars, you might consider becoming a member of the National Association of Scholars. We're always looking for folks, so take a look at our website. I'll say again, any questions you have, please send them to me, Randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'd be delighted to pass it on to our scholars so that they can have the option to respond to your questions. If you want to see this within 24 hours, it will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube website. And I think that's all our business for today at 3:36 p.m. Again, thank you all so very much. It's been wonderful.
Somebody, before you leave,
Oh,
I see somebody asked the question, what's the best biography of Clemens Twain? So I just want to answer that. There's a great older biography from 1963, psychobiography by Justin Kaplan called Mr. Clemens and Mark Twain. I think the best of the more recent ones is Tom Powers, Powers, Mark Twain. Also, awfully fond of Fred Kaplan, the singular Mark Twain. And I'm only halfway through it, but Gary Scharnhorst, if you want to read a triple volume monster, has come out with a 3-volume Life on Mark Twain. So, Michael Dean, there's your answer to your question.
okay. All right. So we have that.